All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to lecture 15.4 that we're going to have today. Let's go ahead and jump into this one. So, for today, we're going to be talking about cerebral asymmetry in thinking. In particular, we'll be talking about some of the language and music related areas of the left and right temporal lobes and how they differ anatomically. The primary auditory area is larger on the right hemisphere. The secondary auditory areas are larger on the left hemisphere in most people. The posterior right temporal lobe is larger than the same region on the left, as is the left parietal lobe relative to the right. Really, some of this fundamental science in the field of behavioral neuroscience was due to the findings of Paul Broca and some of his contemporaries around the mid 1800s. And it was these researchers who discovered that language is lateralized to the brain's left hemisphere. But the implications of the lateralized brain functions did not become fully understood until the 1960s, when Roger Sperry and his colleagues began to study people who had undergone surgical separation of the two hemispheres as a treatment for intractable epilepsy. Now, the region of the sensory motor cortex representing the face is larger in the left hemisphere than in the right. So the left hemisphere has this special role, especially for talking and language. This is associated with Broca's area, which is the area on the visible brain's surface. It's about 1/3 larger in the right than on the left. And the cortical area is buried in the sulci of Broca's area. It's actually larger in the left than on the right. So neurons in Broca's area on the left have larger dendritic fields than the corresponding neurons on the right. And this figure helps to exemplify, I think, some of that cerebral asymmetry. There's this lateral fissure that we can see in the red line here, and it takes a flatter course in the left hemisphere than in the right. As a result, the posterior right temporal lobe is larger than the same region on the left side, and the inferior parietal region is larger in the left than on the right. There are also some of these asymmetries that are found in many other species on this planet. Most mammals and many birds actually have some asymmetries. Cerebral asymmetry, therefore, cannot just be for language, since humans are the only animals that exist that we know of that have a language function with a syntax similar to what we have. But it is believed that language as a mental process really took advantage of some of the existing lateralized processes. There are some interesting actual patient cases that have emphasized some of the functional asymmetry. Um, Now, this usually takes place when there's been somebody who's experienced brain damage in some capacity. So one patient was patient GH, who had sustained damage to the right parietal lobe, and this patient had difficulty copying drawings, assembling puzzles, and navigating around familiar places. So in this case, a lot of this is more of the spatial awareness type task, like visual spatial abilities. Whereas patient MM had damage to the left parietal lobe. This patient had difficulties with language, copying movements, reading arithmetic, and generating names of objects or animals. So in this case, we would say that this is a lot more of the verbal language functioning that's having the deficits or showing deficits. And here we have some figures showing those patients. So to the left is the brain of patient GH. Injury of this area caused those difficulties that we talked about before. And in contrast, patient MM had the damage to the left hemisphere, causing those verbal impairments. Now, associated with some of this too is this two-arm movement series. This is when participants observe the tester perform a sequence of behavioral movements, and then they're asked to copy this movement as accurately as possible. Now, if there's a patient who has a left hemisphere injury, especially in the posterior parietal region, they are impaired at copying these types of movements. A general impairment in making voluntary movements in the absence of paralysis or a muscular disorder is a symptom of apraxia. And apraxia is really the ability to complete a plan of action accurately. Now, we're going back to those patients we talked about before, and maybe not surprisingly, based on the patients and how we had seen them here, we've come to recognize after patients like GH that the right hemisphere really contributes to controlling some of these spatial skills that would be required for you to draw, assemble puzzles, or navigate space. You need to have a spatial awareness in order to accurately complete those tasks or perform those tasks. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere is really going to contribute to controlling the language functioning and cognitive tasks. A lot of those are going to be related to schoolwork, like reading and arithmetic. It also has a role in controlling voluntary movement sequences, and this differs from the right hemisphere's role. Now, what about individuals with a healthy brain that have not sustained damage in a notable way? Now, there is some interesting asymmetry that takes place here as well. One of these abilities can be found in what's called dichotic listening. This is an experimental procedure for simultaneously presenting a different auditory input to each ear through these specific stereophonic headphones. When this is done, the right ear has advantage for verbal information, while the left ear has advantage for musical information, interestingly enough. There's also this interesting asymmetry in the visual system, where the right visual field has an advantage for language-related information, and the left visual field has an advantage for nonverbal spatial information. Now, we've talked about the visual pathways before to the hemispheres, and so this is another kind of interesting like experimental procedure where if we fixate on a target, such as a dot that's positioned straight ahead, all the information to the left of the dot is going to be going to the right hemisphere, and all the information to the right of that dot is going to go to the left hemisphere. So when we're fixating on that point, each eye sees both visual fields, but it sends information about all of the right visual field to the left hemisphere, all the information to the left visual field only to the right hemisphere. In healthy participants who are given short exposure to the stimuli, so we're talking about well under a second, the left hemisphere is more accurate at perceiving words. In contrast, the right hemisphere is going to be more accurate at perceiving objects like faces. If information is presented for a relatively long time, let's say 1 full second, we can easily report what appeared in each visual field. However, if the presentation is really brief for only maybe 40 milliseconds or so, then the task is considerably more complex to complete. This asymmetry also takes place in the cognitive skill of recall, where the left hemisphere has a lot of language functioning, whereas right hemisphere does not have language. But there's still this recall that can happen on nonverbal tasks like visual spatial skills, where if you show somebody an image, and then you ask them to recall that image later on, the right hemisphere will be drawn upon more to actually reproduce or draw that figure as close to what had been seen before. Now, there are a certain group, and it's increasingly rare, of patients who have this condition called split brain. This is done when there's been the surgical disconnection of the two hemispheres, where the corpus callosum has been cut down the midline. Now, remember, we're thinking of the corpus callosum as almost this information superhighway that's allowing the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. So after the corpus callosum is cut, the hemispheres no longer have a way of communicating, which can lead to some interesting problems or difficulties as each of those hemispheres try to function independently of each other, yet within the same person. Now, does asymmetry remain the same throughout our lifetime? Previous anatomy and fMRI activation research has suggested that left lateralization for language really exists since birth. Now, some researchers had looked at fMRI studies, and they showed that young children demonstrate extensive right hemisphere activation for language that declines through childhood. And a similar pattern may exist for other functions, such as visual spatial processing, like bilateral activation, which shows considerable bilateral activation even in adults. And Although these asymmetry studies are really fascinating, what they tell us about the differences between the hemispheres, it's not entirely clear. They tell us that something is different, but it doesn't exactly like specify what that difference is, and it's a pretty broad leap to make any conclusions that one hemisphere houses an entirely different set of skills from the other. So we have to be pretty careful about the interpretations that we make from some of these asymmetry studies. Now, this is going back to those split brain patients that we talked about previously. And in those cases, when the patient has information in the left visual field and it goes through then the right hemisphere, and the information in the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. With the corpus callosum cut, the information presented to one side of the brain cannot travel to the other side. So the right hemisphere, which receives visual input, does not talk, so it cannot respond verbally. So if the right hemisphere is receiving this visual input of a spoon, and you ask the person, what did you see? They are not able to tell you, I saw a spoon. But notably, though, if you ask that person to draw what they had seen, they're probably going to be able to draw an image of the spoon itself. But then if you ask that person, well, what is this? They will not be able to say it. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere, if as that's receiving information, it does not talk, um, but it does not see the object, so it answers that nothing was presented in that case if the information is over there. Or sorry, the left hemisphere does talk. So if the left hemisphere received the information of the spoon, then you asked it, what did it see? It saw a spoon. But if you asked the left hemisphere to draw what it had seen, it would not be able to draw anything. So, and this actually shows some of that example. So if we have the spoons presented to the right visual field, the patient will answer that it sees a spoon. If the spoon is only presented to the left visual field, the patient will answer, I see nothing. Now, although split brain individuals cannot name objects presented in the right hemispheres, they can make correct nonverbal responses. So these individuals will correctly select the object matching the one that was presented using their left hand. And the two hemispheres can act independently. So when each hemisphere is shown a different object, the two hands will select different objects as the correct one. Studies with split brain patients show that the hemispheres process information differently. There's actually more functional overlap between the hemispheres than there was first suspected. And the right hemisphere does have some language functions. The left hemisphere does have some spatial abilities, but without a doubt, these two hemispheres are different. If you are interested in learning more about split brain patients, I would really highly suggest you look up some YouTube videos on the topic. There's a really good one by, I think it's CGP Grey, talking about this particular condition, which I just think is enlightening. And so again, this is really showing us a similar type of task of what we had gone over before. And the main takeaway is that each hemisphere is capable of responding independently. The left hemisphere may dominate in competition, even if the response is not verbal, but especially because the left hemisphere tends to be the more verbal hemisphere of the brain. We think about that as being more aligned with who we are, since so much of how we understand ourselves is through language functioning. Which brings us to some of the nature of that left hemisphere language and thought itself. And as we talked about earlier in this chapter, humans have this unique speaking ability that's housed in the left hemisphere, and humans act as an interpreter, so it can really infer relationships among stimuli. The language capacity and capability of the left hemisphere gives it a capacity to have interpretation that then the right hemisphere lacks. And part of that's because language is able to produce labels and express products of other cognitive systems. And as a species, we tend to make some of these inferences, and we have beliefs about sensory events as a result. Now, as we come to the question of why does some of this asymmetry exist, like why is the left hemisphere specialized for language? The left hemisphere helps to control fine movements, which are necessary for language production. And why is the right hemisphere specialized for spatial abilities? Well, the right hemisphere controls actual movements in space and mental images such as movements. It's really this elaboration of the dorsal stream functions. Theories for the reason of some of this hemispheric asymmetry remains highly speculative. The brains evolved to produce movement and contrast, and construct really try rather this sensory reality. So the asymmetry of the brains may somehow relate to these overriding functions. By comparison, more recently evolved functions like language, for example, are likely extensions of some of these pre-existing functions before. So language is represented asymmetrically, but that does not necessarily mean that the brain is asymmetrical because of language. And part of this is evidenced by the fact that there are many other animals that exist that have cerebral asymmetry, and they do not have language functioning like we do. All right. Now we will move into chapter 15, part 5. All right. Now, in this portion of the lecture, we'll be talking about variations in cognitive organization. There are sex differences in cognitive organization. There's been some persuasive evidence for marked differences between men's and women's performance on many cognitive tests. So, on average, females tend to perform better than males on short-term memory and verbal fluency tests. Meanwhile, males tend to be better than females at spatial relation and mental rotation tasks. Now, again, it's important to recognize no two brains are identical. So there are some differences that are believed to be partially genetically determined. There are also differences that result from plastic changes that are caused by experience and learning and other epigenetic factors. Some brain differences are idiosyncratic, so they're really unique to a particular person, and others are more systematic and common to whole categories of people. Now, again, when we're talking about these broad generalizations, we're saying that on average, if we're taking 1,000 men and 1,000 women, the average scores on short-term memory tests are going to show that the females are better than the males on that given test. That does not necessarily mean that that is true at the individual level. So there's going to be a wide variation in both groups. There's going to be a huge amount of overlap that's going to be taking place. So if you take any two individuals out of that group, there's not a very high probability that we could say with any kind of certainty that the female is going to do better than the male on the short-term memory task. But there is still a possibility. Really the finding here is that there are these group differences that are observed. So I think that's always just an important thing to be remembering as we're talking about some of these things. So this is some of what we just talked about. We're able to see that, again, on pencil and paper tests, they've consistently shown that on average, females have better verbal fluency than males, whereas males do better on tests of spatial reasoning. What does that look like? So we can see on the left, these are some of the tasks that the males tend to do better on, like the spatial relation type task, where participants are asked to draw a line to indicate the water line in a tipped glass, for example. And we can see kind of the correct response versus the incorrect response there. There's also this mental rotation type task where a participant is asked to choose a block that could be made from the plan that's shown above. And males tend to be more accurate than females on that type of task. Meanwhile, on the right, we see up top, they're in short-term memory type tasks. Participants are asked to fill empty boxes with the appropriate symbols. So here I would say, up here we have boxes. They have numbers in the top part, and these special symbols or marks in the bottom part. Each number has its own special design or symbol. Down here we have some more boxes with numbers in the top part. Bottom boxes are empty. What you're to do is you're to fill in the bottom box with a special design or symbol that goes with the corresponding number. So 2 would have this mark below, 8 would have this mark, and so on. When they're asked to complete those, given a large number of boxes to fill with a particular time limit, females tend to complete 10 to 20% more items than males do. Then, On a verbal fluency type task, where participants are asked to fill in the blank to form words that make a sentence, females are generally faster at this type of task than males are. So in this case, with number 1, we have the letters F, M, A, J. And if we had to make a sentence, we might say fast mice are, ooh, I don't even know where I would go with that. Or joyous. Fast mice are joyous, maybe because they can get away from a cat. So you can see there, it took me a long time. I got the first 3 and then had a long pause for number 4. Again, that's an individual data point, but I struggled there to complete that task. So what are some of the neural bases for these sex differences? Research points to sex differences in the brain's gross cerebral structure and at the neuronal level. Part of this is due to some of the gonadal hormones, which do influence the structure of neurons in rats' prefrontal cortex, studies have shown. One example is the medial frontal cortex, where neurons in male rats have these larger dendritic fields, as well as the orbital frontal cortex, where neurons in female rats have longer or larger dendritic fields. These differences are not seen when the rats have had their gonads or ovaries removed at a young age, interestingly enough. So there is some evidence to suggest that these unique differences in these particular areas are due to the gonadal hormones. Now, here in this figure, we can see that women's brain volume in the prefrontal and medial paralimbic regions, which are shown in orange, is significantly higher than men's. Men, on the other hand, tend to have larger relative volumes in the medial and orbital frontal cortex and in the agular gyrus, which is shown in green. The orange areas correspond to regions that have high levels of estrogen receptors during development, and the green regions are related to areas that are high in androgen receptors. There also has been shown some sex differences in gray matter concentration. So women show this increased gray matter concentrations in the cortical regions shown in color on this MRI. Gray shaded areas are not statistically different in males and females. So women have this increased cortical gray matter concentration in many cortical areas relative to men. Men's gray matter concentrations, by contrast, are more uniform across the cortex. The MRI studies that are shown, one of which is here, point to some of the differences between men's and women's cortical organization. So in the frontal cortices of male and female rats, the cells in the midline frontal region, which are shown in the top 2 drawings, are more complex in males than in females, while in contrast, the opposite is true in the orbital frontal region, which is shown in the bottom 2 images here. Doreen Kimura investigated people who had sustained cortical strokes in adulthood, and she had found that men and women are almost equally likely to be aphasic after left hemisphere lesions. Men were more likely to be aphasic and apraxic after damage to the left posterior cortex, and women were far more likely to be aphasic and apraxic after lesions to the left frontal cortex. Females have more interhemispheric connectivity, whereas males have more intrahemispheric connectivity. So females, more that connectivity between the 2 hemispheres, whereas males have more connectivity within each given hemisphere. Some of the evidence for sex differences in the cortical organization, like I said before, apraxia and aphasia are associated with frontal damage to the left hemisphere in women and posterior damage in men. And we can see that evidence here in the graphs that are shown. And this is also just showing us a little bit more of what we were talking about a moment ago, some of the sex differences in the connectome. So the fusion tensor imaging analysis of the brain networks in these dorsal views reveal, like I said, greater intra-hemispheric connections in males, so more connections within the hemisphere, respectively, and greater inter-hemispheric connections in females. So this leads to some questions. Why do males have better spatial skills? Really, I mean, the the answer to this is it's not known. It's hard to try to, I think, understand some of these things in the context of today because these have been shaped evolutionarily over such extensive periods of time. And this isn't something that we're able to test experimentally of like why would this have existed because the reasoning for that has been sculpted by so much of the past. But there is some speculation. There is some work by evolutionary psychologists who believe that perhaps in evolutionary terms, males had to tend to larger territories than females. And perhaps this could be part of that if we think about kind of hunter-gatherer type societies where males may be more likely to be in a hunter role. They would have to navigate larger regions to conduct the hunt, and they would have to be able to return home after going out large distances. Whereas, why do females have better language skills? Perhaps females developed good language skills to engage in social interaction in evolutionary terms. Females may have also been selected for fine motor skills, such as making clothes relative to or related to language. Again, these are some thoughts, but really, it's hard for us to truly understand why this might be overall. Then what about handedness and cognitive organization? Ted Rasmussen and Brenda Milner, they had done some research and they found that speech was localized in the left hemisphere of all right-handed people, but the reverse was not true for left-handed people. So notably, approximately 70% of left-handers also had speech housed in the left hemisphere. However, of the remaining 30%, about half had speech in the right hemisphere and half had speech in both hemispheres. So what we're not saying is we're not saying that in left-handed people, language is housed in the right hemisphere, or right-handed people, language is housed in the left hemisphere. That's not true. Across the board, almost everybody has their language housed in the left hemisphere. However, if you are left-handed, there is a certain percentage of left-handed individuals who have language housed in either the right or in both hemispheres. And this is also done when there's thoughts about some elective neurosurgery that's going to be taking place. Neuropsychologists do a role to try to help tease out where some of that language functioning is, and it's particularly important for left-handed individuals to make sure that there's no let's say, elective neurosurgery done in the right hemisphere, and it actually ends up being where language is housed. So you'd want to have a good understanding of that. There have been some of these neuroanatomical studies where left-handers with speech and in the left hemisphere have asymmetries similar to right-handers. Left-handers with speech originating in the right hemisphere or in both hemispheres have this kind of anomalous speech representation, and the anatomical symmetry is reversed or absent. Now, Sandra Whittleson and Charlie Goldsmith found some other gross differences where the connectivity of the cerebral hemispheres may differ. The callosal cross-sectional area was 11% larger in left-handed and ambidextrous individuals than in right-handed people. And Eileen Luders and her colleagues found that left-handed people tend to be less lateralized in their hand dominance than right-handed people. There was this negative correlation between callosal size and handedness laterality. And the more lateralized the participants were, the smaller the callosum was, regardless of handedness. And also, before I move on to some of the handedness, I think another interesting question, we generally just accept the fact that most people are right-handed, and there are a few people who are left-handed. But I think it's really interesting to consider and think about, why is this the case? Why would it make sense for most people to be right-handed versus left-handed or versus being ambidextrous? And I think that's kind of a question that is worth a little further research if you're just interested in delving more into some topics. We'll talk now about synesthesia. This is the ability to perceive a stimulus of one sense as a sensation of a different sense, such as when sound produces a sensation of color. This has an estimated incidence of 1 in 23 people. It also tends to run in families. The most common form is colored hearing, and most pairings are in one direction only. So in colored hearing, seeing a color does not elicit a sound, but hearing a particular sound can elicit a color. So some people who have something like synesthesia, they truly, genuinely, when they are hearing different sounds and music, they are seeing colors related to it. And so I do not have it. I can appreciate the beauty of music, but for some people, when they talk about the beauty of music, they're talking about a visual sensation as much as they are an auditory sensation, from my understanding. There are some hypotheses regarding the neural basis of synesthesia. There's been some extraordinary neural connections between the sensory regions and increased activity in multimodal areas of the frontal lobes that receive input from more than one sensory area. Particular sensory inputs eliciting unusual patterns of cerebral activation then tend to take place. And again, because each case is idiosyncratic or unique to each individual, synesthesia's neurological basis is difficult to investigate. But again, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's a number of, especially like famous musical artists who have synesthesia, and it's related to some of their musical process. So I would invite you to look up some of those and learn more about it and maybe find some of their interviews. All right, that is the end of this lecture. I will see you again for, I believe, part 6.